In 1934, a millwright in Scranton, Pennsylvania, repaired a cracked cast iron stove using nothing but wood ash, salt, and his own spit worked into a paste with his thumb. He packed it into the crack while the stove was still warm. The fix held for 26 winters. When his grandson hauled the stove to a scrapyard in 1960, the seam he had patched was still solid. The original casting had failed in 3 other places. He never wrote it down. He never told anyone how he learned it. When he died in 1958, that knowledge went into the ground with him. They did not lose these skills because the skills stopped working. They lost them because nobody asked in time. A generation of men carried the entire repair vocabulary of the American household in their hands. Their sons were busy. Their grandsons had television. The knowledge sat in their hands, useful to nobody, until the hands stopped moving. We did not inherit it. We watched it disappear and called it progress. Number 21 was done with a butter knife and held a window in its frame for 38 years. Number 14 kept a workman's boots watertight for 2 years using a material that cost pennies. And number 1, the foundational skill every Depression-era handyman possessed before he picked up a single tool, has been so completely erased that most Americans under 60 cannot name it. These 25 secrets were not tricks. They were the working knowledge of men who could not afford to fail. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 lost repair secrets Depression-era handymen took to the grave. You climbed up with pine pitch warmed over the kitchen stove and tar paper cut from a roll in the shed. You laid the paper over the leak and worked the warm pitch around every edge with a paring knife until it sealed against the shingle. For a coal miner's wife in 1933 in eastern Kentucky, a leak over the children's bed was a winter problem. The water froze in the mattress. She fixed it herself in the dark because her husband was on a double shift. Company housing in the Appalachian coal fields was notorious for roofs the company refused to repair. Pine pitch was free in any wood lot. The skill passed wife to wife across hollers because the company would not. The roof did not need to be beautiful. It needed to keep the children dry. It did. Number 24, straightening a warped floorboard with damp newspaper and weight. You laid wet newspaper over the cupped board, 3 sheets thick, and stacked cast iron sash weights on top. 3 days later, the moisture had worked into the dry side, and the board flattened back into its joists. A foreman in Akron, Ohio, in 1936, fixed every warped board in his rented house this way. He never owned the house. He fixed it anyway. The technique came from 19th century cabinet shops and migrated into industrial tenements, where landlords would not invest $1 in a building they could re-rent the next morning. He did not fix the floor. He restored its memory. Number 23, reseating a loose hinge with a wooden matchstick. You unscrewed the failing hinge. You dipped a matchstick in hide glue, broke it off flush, and tapped it into the stripped screw hole. 2 or 3 matches until the wood was packed tight. Then you drove the original screw back in. For a tenement super in 1931 in the Bronx, doors slammed all day, and every hinge came loose eventually. He carried matches in his coat pocket the way a modern handyman carries drywall anchors. New York building codes required supers to maintain working hardware. Landlord budgets allowed nothing for materials. Supers across the 5 boroughs developed a vocabulary of nearly free repairs that satisfied the code without spending the landlord's money. The screw was not the problem. The hole had grown tired. He gave it something new to bite. Number 22, splicing a broken broom handle with a tin can and 4 screws, Cut both ends of the handle square. Take an empty soup can, remove the top and bottom, and slit it down one side. Wrap the can around the splice and drive 4 wood screws through the tin into the wood. Wrap the tin tightly for a snug splice. A janitor in 1935 in St. Louis kept the same broom for 19 years using this method. He spliced it 4 times. By the end, the handle had 3 tin sleeves stacked along its length. The WPA distributed repair and reuse posters through the decade, reinforcing a single principle. A tool was not finished until every component had failed beyond repair. The broom was not new. The broom was not old. The broom was simply still working. Number 21. Reglazing a window with linseed oil putty. You scraped out the old putty with a butter knife heated over the stove. You pressed glazier's points into the wood with a screwdriver, rolled fresh putty between your palms until it warmed, and pressed it into the frame at a 45-degree angle. A widower in Pittsburgh in 1937 reglazed every window in his house after a hailstorm took out 14 panes. The glazier wanted $4 a window. He had $11 to last the month. Linseed oil putty had been the American standard since the 1840s. Every Steeltown boy learned to glaze a window by his 12th birthday because broken panes were a weekly occurrence. That was not glasswork. That was a man telling the weather it would have to try harder. Number 20. Fixing a cracked window pane with shellac and tissue paper. You laid thin tissue paper over the crack, inside and outside, and brushed shellac across it with a camel hair brush. The shellac soaked through, dried clear, and bonded the crack closed. From 3 feet away, the repair was invisible. A schoolteacher's husband in 1932 in rural Indiana kept 4 cracked windows sealed this way through 2 winters. The shellac was still holding when he sold the house in 1949. The trick originated in one-room Midwestern schoolhouses where teachers patched cracked panes using shellac kept on hand for sealing chalkboards. It migrated into farmhouses where a glazier was a day's drive away. It was not a permanent fix. It was permission to wait until permanent was possible. Number 19. Tightening a sagging cane chair seat with water and sun. You turned the chair upside down, soaked the cane seat with hot water, and set the chair in direct afternoon sun for 4 hours. The fibers swelled while wet and contracted hard as they dried. A seat that had sagged for a decade tightened back to drum tight by supper time. For a furniture maker in 1934 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, this repair restored 6 dining chairs in a single Saturday. Grand Rapids had been the furniture-making capital of America since the 1870s. When the Depression laid off thousands of skilled men, that workshop knowledge moved into private homes across western Michigan. The cane had not failed. It had only relaxed. It needed reminding what it was for. Number 18. Sealing a leaking pipe joint with cotton string and shellac. You shut the water off. You unscrewed the joint, cleaned the threads, and wrapped them tight with cotton string soaked in orange shellac, wrapping clockwise, the direction the fitting would tighten. You screwed the joint back together while the shellac was still wet. A streetcar mechanic in 1930 in Cleveland used this method on every leaking pipe in his 3-story rooming house. He never bought a roll of plumber's tape. Plumber's tape did not exist yet. Cotton and shellac sealing was standard American plumbing from the 1880s through the Second World War, printed in Odell's Plumber's and Steam Fitter's Guide. Teflon tape erased it within a decade. The plumber wanted $6. The cotton string was already in the sewing basket. He chose the basket. Number 17. Fixing a squeaking floor with talcum powder. You found the squeak by walking slowly in stocking feet. You poured talcum powder along the seam between the board and its neighbor, worked it down with a stiff brush, and tapped the board with the heel of your hand until the powder settled deep. A boarding house owner in 1936 in Boston silenced every floor in a 40-room building this way because complaints from light sleepers were costing her tenants she could not afford to lose. Boston in 1936 had over 400 operating boarding houses, most run by widows. These women shared maintenance techniques in church basements alongside cooking and sewing. He did not fix the floor. He simply made it stop announcing itself. Number 16, rehandling an axe with hickory and a wooden wedge. You found straight-grained hickory dried at least a year. You shaped it with a draw knife until it matched the eye, set the head, drove a wooden wedge into the kerf, and soaked the assembly in linseed oil for 3 days. The handle swelled tight. The wedge locked it permanently. A logger in 1933 in the Wisconsin North Woods rehandled 3 axes a year this way. He did not trust factory handles. The grain ran the wrong direction. His did not. The Civilian Conservation Corps camps that arrived in those forests in 1933 hired local loggers as instructors, and rehandling was taught as a required skill across the upper Midwest. The handle was not a part. It was a relationship between a man, a tree, and a tool, mediated by his own 2 hands. Pattern break, the hands that are disappearing. There is a man right now in a nursing home in western Pennsylvania who can re-pour a Babbitt bearing, rebuild a kerosene lantern, and forge a hinge from a horseshoe. He is 91 years old. He learned all of it before he was 16. Nobody has asked him about any of it in 40 years. When he dies, every one of those skills dies with him, not because the information cannot be written down, but because the instinct cannot be transmitted through paper. It only transmits through hands working next to other hands. That apprenticeship is over in America. We are not even recording it. We are just letting it go. Number 15. Patching a galvanized bucket with a bolt and 2 washers. You drove a stove bolt through the hole from the inside out, slipped a rubber washer over the threads outside, slid a metal washer on top, and turned a nut down tight. The rubber compressed against the steel and sealed the leak. A dairy farmer in 1938 in upstate New York patched the same bucket 5 times this way. By the end, it had 5 bolts in a row along the bottom seam. Upstate New York dairy country still ran on hand-pumped water in 1938. Every farm hardware store from Utica to Watertown sold stove bolts in bulk for bucket repair. That was not 5 repairs. That was a relationship with 1 bucket that lasted longer than most modern appliances. Number 14. Waterproofing leather boots with beeswax and tallow. You melted equal parts beeswax and rendered beef tallow over a low flame. You warmed the boots near the stove, and you worked the mixture into every seam with a rag, using the warmth of your fingers to drive it deep into the grain. A railroad section hand in 1935 in northern Michigan walked 12 miles a day in boots treated this way. His feet stayed dry, and the boots lasted 9 years. Railroad section gangs walked 10 to 15 miles per shift in all weather. The beeswax and tallow recipe had been in use among American working men since the 1850s, sold in tins at every northern railroad town. That was not maintenance. That was a man and his boots, talking quietly about how long they intended to last. Number 13. Mending a torn window screen with shellac and thread. This simple repair was a staple during the Depression, a small practice that kept windows usable for years. The emphasis is on making a strong, neat patch that blends in. You will need shellac, a needle, cotton thread, a small scrap of screen or fine wire mesh, and fine sandpaper. Choose a thread that matches the mesh thickness, and keep a scrap of the original screen on hand for a matching patch. Start by trimming any frayed edges around the tear, then brush a thin coat of shellac along the torn fibers to stiffen them. Lay the patch over the tear and use tiny close stitches to sew the patch in place, working from the center out so the repair lies flat. After stitching, brush more shellac over the seams to seal and harden the repair. Let the work dry for 24 hours, then lightly sand any rough spots and add a final thin coat if needed. Homemakers and handymen in the 1930s relied on this method when new screens were scarce. It is a reminder that careful observation and a few simple materials will extend the life of ordinary things. Keep this low-cost trick in your toolbox. You stitched the tear with cotton thread in a simple overcast pattern, pulled the edges together, and brushed 2 coats of shellac across the repair. The shellac stiffened the thread and made the patch nearly invisible. A farmer's wife in 1934 in Iowa repaired every screen in her house this way every spring. Thread and shellac came from the same drawer that held everything else worth keeping. Iowa farm households operated on cash incomes under $400 a year. The State Extension Service mailed free bulletins titled "Make It Do" to every farm wife on the rural route from 1932 through 1944. The patch was not pretty. It was effective. In that year, effective was the only standard that mattered. Number 12. Restoring a rusted file by soaking it in vinegar. You laid the rusted file in a shallow pan of white vinegar overnight. By morning, the rust had loosened. You scrubbed it with a wire brush, dried it thoroughly, and rubbed it with linseed oil. The file cut clean again. A blacksmith in 1932 in central Pennsylvania kept a coffee can of vinegar under his bench. He had files older than his apprentice. The vinegar rust technique was documented in American blacksmithing manuals as early as 1880 and traveled with Pennsylvania Dutch craftsmen into the small forge shops that dotted the state through the early 20th century. A new file would have cut faster. His file cut long enough to outlive the apprentice he taught. You clamped the saw between 2 boards in a vise, teeth up. You stroked a triangular file across each tooth in the direction the tooth was bent, 3 strokes per tooth, every other tooth first, then back across the others. The teeth glinted bright at the tips. A neighborhood carpenter in 1935 in Camden, New Jersey, sharpened saws for every household on his block for 10 cents apiece. He filed 40 saws a month through the worst years of the Depression. The Diston Saw Works in Philadelphia, the largest saw manufacturer in the world, published free instructional pamphlets distributed to teachers and Boy Scout troops nationwide. 3 generations of American men learned the skill from them. The saw did not need to be new. It needed to be sharp. He kept it sharp for 40 years. You shut off the water. You unscrewed the packing nut, pulled the stem, and peeled off the hardened washer. You cut a circle from belt leather using the old washer as a template. You seated the leather, screwed everything back together, and turned the water on. The drip was gone. A streetcar conductor in 1937 in Detroit fixed every faucet in his house this way. The leather came from his father's old razor strop, cracked beyond use for shaving, but good for 40 washers. Rubber washers cost a penny each in 1937. A Detroit conductor earned $18 a week. A penny saved on a washer was a penny that bought a half-pound of beans. That was not a repair. That was a man telling a drip that it would have to find somewhere else to live. Pattern break. Why they wanted you helpless. In 1924, A group of major electrical manufacturers formed a cartel known as the Phoebus Group. Their purpose was simple: shorten the lifespan of incandescent bulbs from 2,500 hours to 1,000 hours, intentionally, so consumers would buy more. The cartel was real. It is widely considered the first deliberate act of planned obsolescence in industrial history. From that point forward, the strategy spread to every category of household good. Products were designed to fail. Replacement parts were made proprietary. By 1970, the average household appliance lasted half as long as its 1935 equivalent. This was not progress. This was a business decision. Your grandfather's repairs threatened a revenue model, so the revenue model removed your grandfather. Number 9. Recaning a chair seat with binder twine. You drilled holes around the seat frame at 1-inch intervals. You wove binder twine, the same twine used to tie wheat sheaves, through the holes in the standard cane pattern, pulled each strand taut and tied off underneath. The seat held 300 pounds. A wheat farmer in 1933 in central Kansas reseated all 6 of his kitchen chairs this way. The repair cost him nothing. The chairs sat 6 grandchildren by the end of his life. Central Kansas in 1933 was the eye of 2 storms, the Depression and the early Dust Bowl. Kansas State Agricultural College mailed free furniture repair pamphlets to farm wives that included this exact technique. The cane store was 40 miles away in Wichita. The twine was in the barn. He chose the barn. Number 8. Reattaching a peeling veneer with a hot iron and brown paper. You laid brown grocery paper over the lifted veneer. You pressed a hot flat iron on the paper for 30 seconds at a time. The heat reactivated the original hide glue underneath. You weighted the area with books overnight. A furniture refinisher in 1936 in Hartford, Connecticut, saved hundreds of pieces of antique furniture this way during the years when nobody could afford new. Hide glue was the standard American furniture adhesive from the 18th century through the 1940s. It had one property modern adhesives lacked. It was reversible. Heat brought it back to life decades after it had cured. He did not re-glue the veneer. He woke up the glue that was already there. Number 7. Filling a wood gouge with sawdust and hide glue. You collected fine sawdust from the same species of wood. You mixed it with hide glue until it formed a paste the consistency of wet sand. You packed that paste into the gouge with a putty knife, overfilled slightly, and let it cure for 2 days. You then sanded it flush. A piano repairman in 1935 in Boston fixed scratches and dents in dozens of pianos this way. The repair was invisible from across a room. American piano manufacturing had peaked in 1909 at over 360,000 instruments a year. By 1935, every American city had warehouses full of used pianos needing cosmetic repair before resale. The wood healed. He simply gave it the material it needed to do the work itself. A graphite pencil, sharpened to a fine point, was rubbed so the lead filled the hinge pin and the surrounding metal. The graphite acted as a dry lubricant, better than oil, because it did not collect dust or run down the door. A school teacher in 1933 in rural Vermont kept a single pencil in the kitchen drawer for this purpose. Every door in the schoolhouse and her home received the same treatment twice a year for 38 years. Rural Vermont schoolhouses were maintained by their teachers, not by school boards. Graphite as a lubricant had been known to American railroad mechanics since the 1880s, and it filtered into rural households through every man who had worked the lines. A pencil cost 2 cents. Oil cost 25 cents, and it ran. The pencil stayed where she put it. Number 5. Repairing a cracked plaster wall with newspaper and paste. You tore narrow strips of newspaper. You mixed flour and water into a thick paste, and you added a spoonful of sugar to slow the mold. You pressed the strips into the crack, layered them flat, and smoothed them with a wet rag. When dry, the patch was harder than the surrounding plaster. A boarding house keeper in 1932 in Baltimore patched every wall in a 16-room house this way. She fixed 40 cracks in a single weekend. Baltimore's row house neighborhoods contain tens of thousands of plaster-walled homes built between 1880 and 1910. Plasterers charged $2 a wall, a figure that priced out every working family in Fells Point and Hampton. That was not a patch. That was the house being told to keep its dignity for another decade. You clamped the shovel head in a vise, blade up. You stroked a flat mill file across the cutting edge at a 30-degree angle, 20 strokes per side. You finished by drawing a smooth stone along the edge to remove the burr. A gravedigger in 1935 in southern Illinois sharpened his shovel every Sunday evening. The same shovel served him for 31 years. He filed away nearly 2 inches of steel over its lifetime. Hand-dug graves were still the standard in American rural cemeteries through the late 1930s. A sharp shovel cut a grave in 3 hours. A dull one took 6 hours. The shovel did not wear out. It was sharpened down to where his hands no longer reached comfortably. Number 3. Patching a torn rug with burlap backing and carpet thread. You laid the rug face down. You cut burlap 2 inches larger than the tear in every direction. You stitched it to the back of the rug with heavy carpet thread and a curved upholstery needle, pulling the torn edges together as you sewed. A widow in 1936 in Philadelphia patched every rug in her house this way after her son could no longer send money home. The burlap came from feed sacks. The thread came from a sewing kit she had owned since her wedding in 1894. The burlap backing technique was taught by Philadelphia's Sewing Cooperative, a WPA program that ran out of church halls across the city from 1935 to 1939. She did not repair the rug. She repaired the floor of a room where her grandchildren still played. You cut a raw potato in half. You dipped the cut side in dish soap or baking soda. You scrubbed the rusted surface as if the potato were a sponge. The oxalic acid dissolved the rust. The soap acted as a mild abrasive. Within 10 minutes, a rusted wrench came back to bare metal. A mechanic's wife in 1934 in Toledo, Ohio, kept her husband's tools rust-free this way every spring. He worked outdoors. The tools sat in a damp shed all winter. She gave them attention with the contents of the root cellar. The oxalic acid content of potatoes had been documented by American chemists in the 1890s. Toledo, Cleveland, and Detroit shared a common vocabulary of working-class household chemistry that moved freely between immigrant kitchens across the Great Lakes industrial corridor. A potato cost nothing. A new wrench cost a day's pay. She kept the wrench. Number 1. Looking at the broken thing before doing anything else. Before any tool came out, before any material was gathered, before any decision was made. The Depression-era handyman stood in front of the broken thing and looked at it. He turned it over. He touched it. He took it apart with his eyes before he ever touched it with his hands. That was the entire skill. Everything else followed from it. A man in 1935 in any town in America did not panic. He did not call. He did not buy a replacement. He looked. He examined. He understood. 9 times out of 10, the repair revealed itself in those first quiet minutes of observation before a single tool ever left the box. This was not handyman knowledge. This was the precondition for it. Without it, No tool would have helped him. With it, almost any tool would do. None of these repairs required a school. None required a certificate. They required something simpler and harder to replace, the willingness to stand in front of a broken thing and believe, without anyone's permission, that you could understand it. That belief was the inheritance of the Depression generation. It was forged in a decade when nothing could be replaced. The men who carried that belief into their old age died holding it. They assumed somebody would ask. Somebody would stand next to them in the workshop one more time, the way they had stood next to their own fathers, and watch. Nobody came. The workshops emptied. The hands stopped moving. The knowledge went into the ground. But the tools are still here. The materials are still here. The broken things are still here, waiting. The work, like the men who once did it, simply needs somebody willing to begin.